Like Tim said, I'm from the Department of Politics at the University of Warwick. So my interest really is in situating sugar within capitalism. You know, is the sort of grand claim that I try and make good on. So this is why I've called it a capital appetite, because what I want to do today really is to denaturalize sugar's role in the diet, to suggest that, you know, this isn't just a kind of result of something intrinsic to the commodity itself, but rather it's a result of the way that the commodity has been used by particular people to make money, essentially. So I'm going to talk about sugar as a capital appetite, and for me it's important to talk about capitalism not as a kind of homogeneous economic system, but as a system which has certain imperatives. It thrusts certain imperatives upon us as individuals and organisations, you know, be it a business, a government, what have you. I'm going to talk about these imperatives in relation to sugar, but just to spell them out now first. One of these is accumulation for its own sake. That means that under capitalism, I think as a business, you have not just a duty, but an actual competitive requirement to continually grow, continually accumulate. And there's no goal to this. It's just simply survival. That's what you do. If you're, you know, a business under capitalism, you have to continually grow and accumulate capital. Otherwise, you're destroyed, basically. You're taken out of the market. So that's the first thing that's important. The second thing is that the state is constitutive of capitalism. So all I mean by this is that rather than thinking of the state, particularly government, being in opposition to the market, you know, this is something I think that neoliberals have done very well at convincing us is the case. Actually, to my mind, and thanks to my training, I believe that you can't have capitalism without the state. So I think, again, that's important to think about when we're trying to ask the question, well, why is there so much sugar and why do we eat it in the way we do, in the dangerous way we do? And the third aspect of capitalism is that it's very, very dynamic. So what I'm going to give you here is a snapshot, but it's ever-changing. And that's for a couple of reasons. First, that there's constant struggles between capitalists. Intra-capitalist conflict is how it's kind of spoken about. But basically, you know, just businesses tussling with one another, and that's having some important change on sugar. And also there's not just battle between business or fractions of capital, but against them, I think. This is the idea that there are often societal responses. If you know Karl Polanyi at all, he talks about a kind of counter-response by society to the diktats of the free market, essentially. So the commodification, deepening commodification of food is a very good example. And just generally the organisation of social life around the quest for profit is something that in different ways people kind of buck against. So essentially the kind of foundation of the talk and my book is that the circulation of sugar, the movement, you know, out of the fields, through the factories, into the supermarkets and down our gullets. That circulation of sugar is structured by capitalism, but capitalism need not be a single fate. You know, it's not this homogeneous system, really. There's different ways of organising it. Okay. So this is just a little bit of background. I wanted to show you where sugar is located in our diet. And by our, in this context, I mean the UK. And you'll see that sugar and preserves is the biggest slice, preserves being jam and so on. Historically, this was much, much bigger. But over time, the use of sugars in processed foods has increased as a proportion. And now soft drinks are one of the biggest categories of sugar consumption. A couple of things about this. It adds up to roughly 22 teaspoons per day. In the UK, the intake of sugar has been showing a slow secular decline. which is something that the industry always reminds people when they kind of lobby against the idea of restricting sugar consumption. But it's worth bearing in mind that this is far in excess of what most medical professionals recommend is eaten. The WHO's recent recommendation was for something around 6 to 7 teaspoons a day. So you can see this is, even though it might be declining, it's still way over what they would recommend. Also, this is based on self-reporting. This is where DEFRA gets their statistics from, asking people to keep receipts and report on what they've eaten. And my suspicion, and this is backed up by things that I've read in journals and so on, is that sugary foods are massively underreported for various reasons. They're eaten outside the home, people forget about them, or they know that there's a kind of expectation that they shouldn't be having too many, so they kind of censor, even to themselves, what they've been eating. So I treat these with caution. And also, a final thing to note is that these average out important differences between age, gender, ethnicity, class, region, all of which change the composition of sugar consumption and where it comes from. So again, I think, take the average with, or treat the average with caution, because it doesn't tell you, for example, about the important differences between groups. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. So what's my analysis got to tell us that's new? Well, I'll try and do a few things. The first one I want to suggest is that sugar's become more prevalent in our diet because it's been particularly useful for food manufacturers, especially, to sell food. Okay, they don't, I don't believe, have an intrinsic interest in promoting sugary diets, but they want to sell products, and sugar's helped them do that. And I'll give 3 reasons why. The first is that the organic properties have been harnessed. So I've italicized that to stress that, this isn't inevitable, but this is a kind of use to which they've been put. The organic properties of sugar have been harnessed to manipulate time. Sounds a bit vague, I suppose, but what I mean by that is the example of this carton of orange juice. I bought this actually when I was doing some fieldwork in Brazil, and I noticed on the back that it had added sugar. So you get the sugars in the orange juice squeezed out, and then they'd added liquid invert sugar. And I thought, oh, why is this? So I began to look into it, and basically liquid invert sugar has a kind of dual function. It both preserves the orange juice itself, which otherwise suffers from perishability. So it preserves that for a much longer time, and also when you drink it, it gives a more instant hit of sweetness. So in its own small way, I think this is a kind of manipulation of the natural temporalities of food. And this is really useful because as far as businesses are concerned, it gives you a much longer shelf life in which to transport your product, keep it on the supermarket shelf until it's ready to go. And obviously when the consumer drinks it, bang, it has that instant effect that they come to recognize and appreciate. So sugar's role in aiding the durability of industrial foods, alongside things like canning, freezing, refrigeration, dehydration, have all been essential, I think, to the spread of this particular kind of food throughout the global economy. The second reason they've been useful is in encouraging overconsumption. So there's some interesting work here on the hedonic effects of sugar, which is to say that when you eat sugar or ingest it, often in combination with fatty foods. So a good example here would be the kind of cola drink and burger and fries that's sold together in fast food outlets. They have an effect on your brain, essentially, which overrides a feeling of satiety, a feeling of fullness. So your body doesn't realize that you're full up and you continue to overeat. That's kind of interesting to me, but I don't really know much about the kind of biochemistry of the brain, so I just simply note that as a possibility. But what I would kind of stand behind are the activities of the food industry in encouraging particular forms of purchase. One of these is bulk buying, and the size of the bottles of Coke kind of indicate here that they are sold in portion sizes that you could never consume in one sitting, and often people buy them and then drink more than they want. Or also impulse buying. So that's the idea that woven into every sort of orifice of our daily life is an opportunity to buy sweetened food products. So in this sense, the food manufacturers in particular, in league with the retailers, have found ways to really modify meal times and to encourage people to eat when perhaps social convention would dictate that they wouldn't eat. For example, a mid-morning snack, chocolate biscuit, for example, something like that. In this respect, I think vending machines are really interesting. I just did a little check before I came out. We often focus on supermarkets when we're thinking about retail infrastructure. But there's about 18,000 branches of Walmart and Tesco's in the world, 18,000. There's 18 million vending machines, which to my mind are almost exclusively stocked with, long life products that are often heavily sweetened. So, just the kind of sprinkling of these around is notable, I think. The last thing that sugar has been useful in doing is enrolling new consumers. So I think we're all quite conscious of the kind of appeal of sweetness to younger people. Their palates are, I believe, sort of more reactive to sweeter foods. And we'll also all be well aware of the kind of marketing spectacle that children in particular are kind of exposed to around sweetened foods. But again, to my mind, this kind of misses something that's of particular political interest, which is what's going on here is actually the actualization of children as market participants, which is to say they're given a command over how money is spent because of what food advertisers really are doing, which is quite powerful. For example, research on the pester power of children, nagging their parents, typically it'll be the mother, for sweetened snacks throughout the day, can levy quite a kind of a toll, I think, on parents, which is not often appreciated. And also some research now shows that children actually, because of pocket money or waged work that they do, actually have quite a large effective demand themselves. So in thinking about enrolling new consumers into the marketplace, I think sugar has been quite potent in that respect. And I'm focusing here a lot on the UK, but I do think that the spread of sugary diets in the global south, which is where the big markets or the fastest growing markets are based, this is intimately tied up to my mind with capitalism, in the sense that we see a historic shift of women into the workplace, into waged work, which has the effect of giving them less time to prepare home-cooked meals. I'm not endorsing this as their natural role, by the way, but this is, in many places, how the division of labour has been instituted on a sexual basis, a gender division of labour. And also, the Sydney Mint's argument about sugar's role in industrialising Britain, I still think is very relevant to what's going on in China, for example, which is sugar provides cheap calories for the workers. And I think that has a part to do with why new consumers are being enrolled into food markets through sugar around the world. Okay. So that's sugar's role in helping to extend accumulation ever further, okay? What I want to say now is just something briefly about the role of the state in this. As I mentioned before, I think the state is constitutive of capitalism. So there's loads of ways it's involved. One way is through the protection of intellectual property, without which all of this marketing collapses, in my opinion, because if Coca-Cola invests all these billions of dollars in marketing campaigns, then another company comes along and puts the same logo on the can of Coke, then you've got a free rider problem, and there's no economic benefit for Coke in doing all this advertising. So the state guarantee of that the brand will be protected is critical to enabling this marketing to take place. Another one is planning law and the provision of infrastructure, rail, road, freight, etc., which allows these durable foods to move around. But what I want to say a little bit more about is agriculture and trade policy, which has kept sugar as a raw material available and stable. So what I did here, this is from my book, which, as Tim mentioned, I do keep finding myself plugging. I went on the World Bank database and found the real price of raw sugar, and found that it was remarkably stable over time. There's a couple of blips in the US in the 70s when their trade system momentarily liberalised, but actually state support for farmers in the global north and their protective agricultural policy has, I think, been a boon to food manufacturers who've had constant access to this key raw material at relatively cheap prices. I think they will always complain that they can get it cheaper on the world market, but I can go into this more in the questions and answers if you like, but that's an unfair comparison in my mind. The domestic availability of raw sugar has been assured for them, and that's thanks to government policy. I think we can see this in a cost breakdown of household products. So what I did here was maybe not very scientific, but I just wandered into Tesco's, my local Tesco's one day, and found products. These were all end of aisle, they were all on special offer, they were all being sold in multi-packs or multi-serving portions. So if anything, they should have been cheaper than well, they were cheaper than what they're normally presented as. So in a sense, I'm really stacking this in favour of the food manufacturers because I'm taking their kind of cheapest offer basically for their products. And what I found, this is never revealed, there's a complete lack of transparency, I believe, in how raw materials are, the price that are paid for raw materials. You really have to go around the houses to work this out. But this is my attempt, and what I found was in most products the cost of sugar is minuscule, really. So all of these products contain often very little but sugar. You know, sugar in all of these was one of the 3 main ingredients. So it's essentially what you're paying for on a nutritional basis, but it's so cheap. And what that means is that the rest of that price that you pay is open to other uses. So things like marketing, distribution, and dividends. So you might know, for example, that, where have I got? Ski yogurt, they're owned by Nestle. You might know that Ben & Jerry's were fairly recently bought out by Unilever. But I had a look into some others. McVitie's biscuits, household brand, they're owned by Yildiz Holding of Turkey. Hartley's jam, they're owned by Heinz Celestial Group from the US. So these brands, you know, that for me, that trading of them, that is indicative of their profitability. That, you know, they're sought after by these investment companies and global financiers, essentially. So, what about this dynamism that I spoke of, this change? Well, what I see is one vector of change in the way that sugar comes to us or not within our food is through product reformulation. So this is interesting politically because reformulating products that we think of as sugary, that we expect as consumers to be sugary, reformulating them with artificial sweeteners kind of drives a wedge between sugar producers and final food manufacturers. It's to say to the final food manufacturers, look, you don't necessarily need this product, and you don't necessarily need to be in a political alliance with this agricultural bloc. So I believe that the shared interests of sugar beet and cane processors and final food manufacturers in the mass production of sweet industrial foods was the great unifying project of sugar politics in the 20th century. Sorry for quoting myself there. But that was the 20th century, and in the 21st century, I see these bonds weakening. Final food manufacturers no longer need sugar to sweeten their products, but equally, sugar producers no longer need final food manufacturers to sell their sugar. Around 15% of global sugarcane production now goes into the biofuel market. And there's other things you can do with it besides, plastics and so on. You don't have to squeeze the juice, turn it into sugar and sell it as a foodstuff. There are other ways. So this kind of historic alliance is weakening, and that's tremendously important politically. The other intra-capitalist development that I see as being quite important, although this is maybe more long-term, the development of what are kind of called here post-industrial foods. Some people call them functional foods, but I liked the term post-industrial just to stress the break with what's gone before. Post-industrial foods, I believe, are best conceptualized as being designed and produced in conjunction with the consumer, tailored to their individual needs. So it's not about just putting something out there that's universal and standardized and trying to sell it to the masses. It's creating niche within niche within niche, tailored to you as an individual. And a company like Nestle is pouring millions of dollars in R&D into this in respect to what I think of as a kind of medicalization of diets. That is to say that what we eat is now being kind of tied to the prevention of disease or even the treatment perhaps. So this is something that they've come up with for diabetics basically. So Nestle essentially selling sin and salvation. You know, they sell kind of chocolate bars to kids, and then when those kids become old and become diabetic, they can sell you boost glucose control. Sorry?
Including formula for babies.
Including formula for babies. There's a historic yes, issue with Nestle there. So for me, this goes kind of hand in hand with this turning everyday life toward kind of life logging and self-surveillance, where we're we're encouraged to kind of record how often we go for a run and our blood pressure and so on. And I think, you know, my kind of dark vision of the future is where this data becomes entwined with food manufacturers and retailers who are able to sell us kind of individual dietary plans over the internet, and they come to our door through online shopping. But that's just the kind of suggestion of where we might go with this. So things are changing, but we might, for very good reason, I suggest, not want to leave this change in the hands of powerful companies. When we think about some of the externalities of capitalist production, it's in some ways a kind of obvious next step to invoke the state. So a good example here would be when a sugar plantation pollutes nearby watercourses, you think the obvious thing to do is to say, well, there needs to be more state regulation of the licenses that they're giving, or the checks that they're doing. Likewise with you could call them externalities in health, where companies sell sweetened foods and drinks, but they don't pick up the tab for the health costs associated with that. That comes from the taxpayer in this country, at least, through the NHS. And so there's calls to tax sugar, for example, to kind of, in a way, internalise the cost of this externality. So I see an appeal to the state as a natural thing to do when we're thinking about political agency. What can consciously be done to change the way that we eat and the way that food is produced. But I think treating it as the exclusive site of political agency is problematic, because it overlooks other forms of societal counter-response, to use that kind of Polanyian term again. One of these is dietary trends, which I think have been overlooked. Perhaps it's a kind of hypothesis, because they rest on a feminized notion of agency. This doesn't mean that they're just promoted by women, although Davina was a good example, but that they rest on types of agency which are associated with feminine domains. I used the rabbit ears to suggest there's nothing natural about this, but feminine or feminized domains like fashion or shopping, and healthy eating, perhaps you might stretch that far. But this for me is a really significant way in which people's cultural expectations about what a good diet is and what they should do to be a kind of moral consumer are. And I think it's probably something for the sociologists and anthropologists to write more about. Maybe indeed they have, and I've missed it. But I think this is profoundly important. In the same way, actually, that historians have wrote about the feminized agency of housewives in the colonial era who promoted the abolition of the slave trade, and they said eating sugar is like eating the flesh of slaves. And there's some argument that said, if you want to understand abolition, you don't go to the state and the arguments of Wilberforce and so on. You have to go to civil society and the everyday actions of housewives in this instance, who were largely responsible for the purchase of sugar at that time. So I just throw that out as an important vector of change. This is the kind of penultimate slide. One danger I kind of perceive within the dietary, the reliance perhaps on prominent authors and bloggers and so on to kind of collectively shift our dietary patterns, is that work, for various reasons, is not always sensitive to hierarchies of inequality. I think quite rightly there might be a suggestion made that this is a kind of white middle class project, basically, and I think there might be something in there. So I'm cautious, I suppose, about putting all my eggs in that basket, as it were. So I thought and thought and thought, what would my argument for progressive politics of sugar be? Well, I think, first of all, lose the commodity fetish, by which I mean it's not all about sugar, and this is kind of difficult to justify when you're writing a book on sugar, which is called Sugar. But I can conceive perfectly easily of a world in which people eat much less sugar, but there's still huge inequalities in health, for example. I don't think reducing sugar in and of itself will necessarily change some of the things that I think need to change. So my preference is to say, yeah, okay, let's see sugar as a problem, but use it as a window or lens, perhaps, on the social relations of food that lie behind that. So two things I'd briefly suggest that could be done to advance a kind of social, a more equal social relations of food. The first would be to defend universal and or decommodified forms of food provisioning. So in layman's terms, that might just mean something like universal school meals, okay? I wouldn't say that they necessarily have to have no sugar in them, but divesting the provision of school meals of the profit motive, I think, makes it a lot easier to shift pupils' diets away from what they might otherwise be in a fair fashion. Another way of thinking about decommodified food might just be about kind of sharing, basically. I, again, just have a hypothesis that the individuation of diets, that is to say that I would suggest in the UK that more and more of us buy food for ourselves rather than rely on someone else, again, probably typically a mother or female family figure, to buy that food and prepare it for us. I suggest that that might be another way in which sugar has kind of been able to find its way into our diet. So decommodifying food provision, but in a way that doesn't rely on this unfair and unequal sexual division of labour, I think is quite important as well. The second thing would be to, when we're thinking about social relations of food, would be to think about production, really. I don't think it's any coincidence that sugary diets are more prominent among lower socioeconomic groups, and also lower socioeconomic groups are employed often in the food industry at pittance wages. I'm not sure that that's just a kind of accident, really. So, you know, if we're thinking about providing the living wage, for example, for all the people who work in shops and restaurants and cafes, etc., who often, you know, do the job of selling this sugary food, might actually have a more important effect than just focusing on people as consumers, you know, focusing on them as producers. And I haven't even got into the production of sugar itself in this presentation, but take it from me, there's gross exploitation of farmers and workers throughout the world, and many of these people who work in the industry also have terrible diets for obvious reasons. They don't have any money. Okay, so I'll leave you with a thought. If the problems of food, this is a political economist's thought, if the problems of food are because of the endless quest for profit, and do we need a different way of making profit? This is to focus on, you know, intra-capitalist conflict and change, or a different value put on food. I would suggest that it's going to be a mixture of both, but with inevitable tensions and trade-offs along the way. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Ben, thank you very much. I mean, to kick it off, I thought what you were raising a very stark case. The state, if a new politics of sugar and the politics of sugar as part of public health is upon us, which it is, you're saying this is actually a battle not for health but for the state. Point one. Point two, it didn't seem to me, except it's implicit in what you said here now, not the book, but here now, that there therefore has to be a politics of resistance. Or sorry, not has to, but you're implicitly asking, where's the politics of resistance? So my question to you is the politics of health becoming the politics of the state? Is that what you see it as being? The fight over sugar and health is actually a, you put it up, almost civil society resistance to the state. That's a question. And my second question is, you focused in your talk heavily upon consumption I mean, you don't have much time, but in your conclusions at the end of your recommendations, you're focusing upon consumption, but you didn't say anything about production. I mean, what is your thinking about the case that some people argue, and in fact was in one of the food research collaboration papers, there are 2 research collaboration papers on the website about sugar, if you haven't read them, people, is the progressive future, to use your terms, the reduction of sugar production? And then you're talking really serious international political economy issues about trade, highly exploited labour, marginalised countries, post-colonial politics, basically. So you don't have to answer those, but I thought I'd just raise them, unless you do want to answer them. We've already got questions. You can think.
Yeah,
You have to have this. Let's take it from the front. The rule is you have to say who you are.
Yes, my name is Iza Kruszewska. I'm a freelance activist. Can you be a freelance activist? Anyway. No, I mean, it's an obvious question. I'd like your take on the sugar tax. Is it too simplistic? Does it give us a clear demand, a civil society? Yeah, what's your take on it?
Thank you. Yeah.
How do you want to do this? Do you want to take a few at a time?
Well, I've got. Would you like me to answer yours, or were they sort of rhetorical?
Yeah. Whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Briefly.
yeah. I suppose on the first about the politics of the state, I suppose I would cleave to this line by Karl Polanyi, which I mentioned before, which is to say that when a society is subject to the increasing pressures and rectitudes of the free market, there is inevitably a kind of backlash, which brings together some surprising groups in society sometimes, and they appeal to the state for protection. And I see, in a way, something akin to that happening in relation to sugar. So, yes, it's the politics of the state, and I would say resistance, in a way, is inevitable, although it might be suppressed or co-opted in some way. That's a very theoretical answer, I suppose.
Is everyone familiar with the book he's referring to? Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, 1944. Read it.
Yeah,
I presume that's what you're...
it's It's a source of inspiration, really. The second about the corollary of reducing sugar consumption being the reduction in production is true as far as it goes if you're talking about the production of food sugar from sugar cane and sugar beet. But as I mentioned, you can do other things with those crops, and that's increasingly what the kind of major sugar producers are looking to do now. You know, they want to diversify their markets, basically, because I think they see this. I think they see food sugar as a cash cow that's kind of almost been milked dry. That said, you know, this is a very Anglo-centric perspective, and in countries from Malaysia to Bolivia, the sugar consumption's, you know, going up 7-8% a year, at least according to the data.
But as I understood it, I shouldn't come back to you, but I must. What you're giving is Ben Fine's argument, which is that sugar has these organic qualities, not organic in the sense of no pesticide, but it's malleable. It can be turned into many things, and it has great opportunities for both being exploited and for adding to exploitation because of those organic qualities in the food.
Yes, yeah, that is that is Ben Fine et al.'s argument, I suppose.
Does everyone know Ben Fine? Yeah, lots of people nodding. Professor of economics at SOAS.
Yeah, although oddly, I mean, given his training and other work, he doesn't say all that much about exploitation and the sources of value in sugar production. I don't really think, which is a bit surprising. But so yeah, as I mentioned on the slides, thinking about the possibilities that the organic properties of sugar give you only takes you so far. I also think you have to appreciate the fact that it's being made cheap and available and stable of price, and to understand that you have to look at the labour regime and all these issues around land grabbing and so on and so forth, which in their book they don't really do so much, but again I think maybe they had a different purpose. Yeah. Yeah, the sugar tax. Yeah, I think I've decided that the sugar tax is a good thing, and it was a difficult one because I'm conscious of the fact that it is a regressive tax. So it comes with a large caveat, which is I think the duty take from this tax would have to be ring-fenced and spent on things like universal school meal provision, which it may be an opportune moment because as I understand, George Osborne is saying that we can't fund this anymore, even though the policy was only pushed through a couple of years ago. So they're looking for money to support something that I think is really important, and I would suggest that a sugar tax could be a happy coincidence there.
Okay, thanks very much. We had 2 questions here, 3 questions here. 1, 2, 3.
It's Ayşegül Kesimoğlu. I'm from City University, PhD student. Culture and Creative Industries is the center that I'm from. I'm not sure if the question is as relevant to the area that you research, because I focus on food and culture, and I actually wanted to ask you about the previous slide where you said we need to focus on social relations of food rather than the commodity argument. And from what I know from my own research, it's this. Let me give you an example from the media, for instance. There is this obsession now with bake-off or baking, and there are actually subcultures and groups that get connected on baking and consuming sweets and sugar.
Yeah.
Girls bond over ice creams, just to give you an example. So when you focus on the social relations of food, how will you overcome these other cultural dimensions? Because as Tim was saying, it seems like you're also like pursuing an implicit political resistance, but then I think it also takes changing the perceptions of the consumers first. And I just wanted to ask if that was something that you thought of at all.
Not specifically, so thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, sorry, I'll go for it because it got me thinking now. I suppose in that respect, that might serve as a good example of what I'm talking about in relation to the, again, I use this term from Karl Polanyi, the kind of re-embedding of exchange in social relations, which is to say, you eat ice cream not because you've had it kind of forced upon you by a very aggressive multinational ice cream company, but because you see it as a way to bond with your friends, and I guess there might be, a difficulty in reconciling that behaviour with health imperatives. You know, you might say, can't you bond over peaches instead or whatever? To which I would kind of just become ambivalent, I suppose, and suggest that my academic interest is in preserving that sanctity, I suppose, in a way. And then, I don't really have an agenda beyond that in saying that you should or shouldn't use sugar in this particular way. It's a bit evasive, I'm sorry. But
You're being evasive, but that's because you haven't thought about it. To be honest, as I understood you, what you were saying, I thought what you were saying is that sugar is social glue. It's a major fact. Yeah.
We can't debate why it has come to be this way. It's probably because of all the arguments you are making.
Well, yeah.
It's political economy, profits, and all that. But it rests there as a fact, and it's it's become a subculture in a way, and how to actually, you know, I think it's a bigger, yeah, you're exactly right, it's a bigger argument. It's probably another research question, how to change the perceptions of people and make them more aware about the health consequences. It's actually going against their probably. Yes, exactly.
I don't know if it helps answer the question at all, but it does bring to mind, as I understand, a shift in British youth today away from alcoholic drinking and toward coffee drinking as a recreational activity, which I don't think anyone saw coming and was unplanned, but nonetheless it's happened and might be kind of applauded or celebrated from a health perspective. So yeah, I guess, as you say, that these cultures are there as a fact, but they're not impervious to change by any means. Thanks, though. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I'm Tara Garnett, Food Climate Research at University of Oxford. I've just got a couple of questions. One is, my understanding is, and I might be wrong, that only 30% of sugar grown globally is actually traded. So perhaps you could comment on the relationship between that non-traded sugar and your argument about capitalism.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. I have just a comment. You were talking about how sugar helps preserve food out of time and out of place. And yes, but that's pre-capitalist, and that's been going on for yonks. And arguably, all those modern technologies such as freezing and other forms of preservation such as those sorts of things provide an alternative to sugar, and one can be seen as old capitalism, the other could be seen as new in some ways. And then the third sort of point I wanted to make, you're saying that sugar encourages us to overconsume, and I'm prepared to buy that, but I'm also mindful of the fact that when rates of obesity were lower, overall sugar intakes were higher. And just this idea, and I think you touched upon it in one of your slides, about this kind of post-sugar where we're all going to something else, and then mindful of Tim's comment about a resistance. And I see on the internet this whole rise of kind of clean eating, no sugar, etc., which at one level, a very trite level, you could see that as resistance, and I see that as actually very, very fundamentally deep conformism with notions of what an attractive body might look like, and a sort of orthorexia, which is completely towing the party line of how we should be. It is deeply conformist, so I just wanted to comment on this.
Thanks. Okay, well, you're exactly right. Thanks for the questions. You're exactly right on the proportion of sugar that enters international markets. The majority remains within the country that it's produced within. That's one reason why, or that's a result, I should say, of the fact that markets have been structured by governments to create higher domestic prices and treat the world market as a kind of dump market where sugar that you can't sell domestically because of quotas and so on just gets thrown on the world market. And that's why sugar producers say this is an artificially low price. It doesn't reflect the true price of sugar, which is what kind of liberal economists claim. As far as the relation to capitalism goes, I would suggest that this emerges out of the demand by farm lobbies for protection from the vagaries of the market. They want safe, assured markets to sell into. And again, this is my political economy training tells me that we shouldn't see the state and market in contradistinction to one another. It's often businesses that call upon the state to put in place policies to help them continue to exist, basically, and that sugar's a good example of that, I think. Different parties want liberalisation for different reasons, so that's a kind of intra-capitalist conflict there. On the preserving thing, that's really interesting. I suppose what I would say is that it's not perhaps the technique itself that I'm interested in, although I have to say I don't know really anything about the historical uses of sugar for preserving. But I would say that there's been a qualitative shift from using sugar perhaps within the family or by petty traders perhaps to preserve, and now its use in industrial manufacturing on a much grander scale. I would suggest that is a qualitative shift that does bear the argument that capitalism has done something differently to how sugar is used in relation to food. The last question is, again, a great one. I don't know this term orthorexia, but presumably that means a way of managing the body that is... Oh, right, okay.
Kind of the idea that we have to be, conform to whatever particular health diet is being, put up there as being, whether it's, there's any number out there, but there is a kind of sugar-free, dairy-free, everything-free thing going on.
Yeah, it's a really good one, and to put it in relation to resistance, I think what it makes me come to the immediate conclusion is resistance to what? So if it's you could argue perhaps it is resistance to a food environment that pushes certain choices your way, but equally you could argue that it's a tacit acceptance or reinforcement of an aesthetic regime which pushes a certain body type your way. So in some respects it might be a relational resistance. That's the only way I can think to get out of that little cul-de-sac.
No, you don't have the answers. These are big questions.
Hi. Yes, another one. I'm Courtney Scott. I'm a PhD student at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. My question is about your last slide. And first of all, thank you. This was a really interesting talk, and I'm very thought-provoking, so I was pleased to be here. Your point about a different value of food, I think, is a really interesting one, especially because you started out looking at it very politically and very economically, and then you've ended up talking about values. And I think that's a really important point, especially on the advocacy point of view, because value-based messages resonate quite strongly with both consumers and politicians. So I think that's a really interesting shift that you've added to the debate. My question is a little bit related to that, in that the opposite of this kind of sugar-laden, ultra-processed food in many discussions is this whole foods debate, which you've kind of hinted at, that there's a relationship here between kind of elitism and values associated with that. And so I think that might be a challenge that would have to be overcome in shifting this debate towards one about values, is this kind of embedded elitism around Whole Foods farmers markets, which we have to overcome in order to kind of make progress in this area. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No, only that it's a good point. Yeah, there was an interesting piece I read on Open Democracy the other day from another self-defined activist, actually. I think his name was something like Steve Toddler or something like that. Yeah, he made the point that the debate around the sugar tax is profoundly patronising toward poor people, essentially. And I share some of that concern, actually. So in some respects, I think I personally need to be very careful to suggest that people who eat a lot of sugar are essentially dupes, right? And they've got no brain in their head which tells them this isn't good for me or my children and I shouldn't be eating it, and they can't cook 4p pack of porridge, which was the famous comment or infamous comment from Baroness, was it Baroness Jenkin around food poverty? Yeah. So yeah, I'm mindful of that, and I think I need to do more work myself to suggest how ideas of individual agency can be reconciled with structural inequality. That's the tension as I see it.
But you said it earlier, sugar is cheap. I mean, that's what Sid Mintz's argument was all about, and it was Cobbett's argument as well. Cobbett said, this is dangerous, this is cheap calories.
Thank you. My name's Anne Murcott. I'm at SOAS. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
I've got two questions. One is sublime, the other ridiculous, and I'm going to leave you to decide which is which. Would you mind going back to your slide where I think it's figure 2.4, presumably from your book?
Yes, yeah.
That one. Could you tell me the source of the cost of sugar? Where do you get that figure from, those data?
Sorry, you might have to bear with me.
I presume that was the trick.
It's just this is a request for information. It's no trick question.
Yes, no. I took the annual average EU price for refined sugar
Okay.
and calculated it on the basis of the grams of sugar content listed on the product's nutritional label.
On the label, right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Well, then the other question is, going right to your final points,
Yeah, shall I whiz?
which, after all, you've pointed out that the state is integral to capitalism. Let's squish your argument together under that heading.
Yeah, yeah.
You didn't specify which state, so you're somehow incorporating multinationals, the international aspect of food systems,
Yeah.
in which case my question is, have you not considered nationalising the food supply?
Yeah, okay. I sort of did jokingly. I was writing the chapter and the introduction, and I was setting out the terms of the debate and said, look, you need to analyse sugar in relation to global capitalism, not because you want communist revolution of the food system. And then I thought, oh, what would that mean? You know, eaters of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your fast food chains, you know. And I thought it was quite a funny little joke, so I put it in. And I didn't really take it any further, and perhaps I should have, not necessarily. Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting intellectual question to ask, really. What would a socialist agenda look like in relation to sugar and consumption specifically? I mean, I do.
And you didn't ask about a socialist approach to sugar. You said, why not nationalise sugar production? That was to,
Yes.
I presumed.
Yeah.
Are people familiar there was an attempt to nationalise British sugar production and colonial?
Well, the food system. So it was.
Oh, you should.
It was a
Make it into the recording.
yeah.
Sorry, I was not asking specifically about nationalisation of sugar supply. I was asking in general, since the way you cast your final question was general. There's a logical consequence of the way you're posing all this, which is to say, therefore nationalise. I've only seen this proposed once, and I can't even remember the author's name, to my shame, and that was in a Canadian PhD. I have never been able to find it anywhere else, that there's a proposal to nationalise the food supply as a way of dealing with the link between capitalism and the state. So I just wondered whether you'd pushed your own thinking to that particular, well, it may not be the only logical conclusion, but it's certainly one.
No, thanks for pushing me, because it is something I've kind of got nervous around, if I'm perfectly honest. In the book, I did look briefly at nationalisation of sugar as a mode of worker ownership. That is to say, you know, workers form trade unions gain political power, etc. This has happened historically in the Caribbean and more recently in Venezuela, and the results are not pretty, at least in Venezuela, as far as I can make out. And I kind of suggest that might be to do with not ownership per se, but rather democracy, perhaps, which is to say that when the sugar industry has been nationalised, it's not been run by the workers for the workers. It's kind of that idea has degenerated to some extent, and it's been managed in a self-serving and highly politicized way, perhaps subject to some of the same dysfunctions that organized capital has been the same kind of critiques that could be levied on organized capital, you know, the way that those companies have been run as subject to, you know, profiteering and all the rest. So I would suggest that it's not a simple, straightforward answer, which I know you're not proposing, but it's an interesting one to go down, I think, to say, well, what, you know, if capitalism does have these fundamental contradictions, what do you do about it? And I'm, to some extent, kind of hiding from that a bit. So
Yeah, you are hiding from it. It's
yeah.
noted. Don't worry.
It's not so much a question, but a comment.
Say who you are.
Yes, oh, sorry. Alvaro de Miranda. I'm currently working on the book on capitalism and obesity. I quite agree with your sentiments that you began with, that the problem is capitalism, not sugar. And a lot of what you say is about that. I also agree with the critique that you've had, that quite a lot of recent politics of food are focused on the state and on policy implications. And I think that's very limited. Your call for kind of addressing civil society is quite relevant in many ways. The problem is the nature of politics in general. The politics that Tim and I grew up with, the politics of food that Tim and I grew up with, was very different from the politics of food of today, because it was part of an existing anti-capitalist movement that we took part on. When that movement subsides and doesn't exist anymore, then the attempt to influence societies focuses much more on the limited aims of influencing government policy. It's inevitable because you're not part of a wider base. The positive thing is that I've got a sense that things may be changing quite significantly in that respect, and we as academics may be beginning to be able to address and be more influential in terms of a movement in which the politics of food is part of a wider politics of movement from below, rather than an attempt to influence society. But at the analytical level, I've been quite unhappy about two aspects. A lot of the politics of food tends to end up with a discourse that says it's all the problem of the big monopolies and the big multinational corporations, which we know are part of the capitalism itself. And we're all being sold through publicity and advertising. We're being duped. That's got a problem. It places us all as being stupid and duped. The problem is that capitalism works. And the relationship between consumption and production, I think that's one of the main problems, is that we, as individuals and as consumers, are produced by capitalism itself. And analytically, that hasn't been done. In other words, why is it that adverts for food operate? How is it that we are being constructed by the capitalist system, because we are being constructed in order to be the use of children in advertising, which you highlighted, is not just about food. It's about a process of making customers of young children right from the beginning. I think there's a need to focus much more analytically on the relationship between production and consumption and the way that the production system is actually constructing us as as consumers.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing I would say to that briefly is, well, again, I think I agree with you, but when I'm still mindful that I didn't do justice to this question of nationalisation. When I think critical scholars look for alternatives to capitalism, it's tempting to go to a place, it may be a different time or a place in the world, which is a kind of self-defined opposition to capitalism, like lots of people write about Venezuela or have done about Cuba, for example. What I found more interesting was to find those spaces that exist at the moment, you know, that are practiced every day, that can't really be adequately defined as capitalism, that in some sense have different logics at work. So one example would be a baker cake sale, right? This is a way in which labour, people baking cakes, you know, all this happens through sugar. People bake cakes, other people buy them, perhaps they pay over the odds, it's not market price, they pay over the odds, that money is given to a charity which then does some kind of work like care for the elderly or whatever. So for me, that's a kind of a way, an entirely functional way of managing an economy. You know, it's no different really to buying a chocolate bar from a shop and then the VAT from that chocolate bar funding the NHS, in a sense. But it's something that we can all relate to and say, hey, yeah, that we can kind of eat and buy and work and live in a different way. And I think that might be more potent, a kind of, I think David Graeber calls it baseline socialism, than thinking about a kind of grand state socialism, which is kind of embodied by the nationalised industry.
That's your answer to that.
Yeah, eventually, sorry. Yeah.
Bring us off the heights.
I'm Tony Allen from King's College and from SOAS. I had an appetite for a more radical analysis of sugar and capitalism.
I'm sorry to have left you unfulfilled.
So you can give us some more at the end if you wish. I've just got a rather detailed comment. I'm forced to look at food prices, international food prices. They're not very fascinating, but they're terribly important. And commodity prices in general. I mean, there are phenomenal things that have happened in the political economy of energy that between about 1900 and 1973, $2 oil was there. I mean, that's not in the market. That's something manipulated by a political economic system. But food, on the other hand, has been falling for 1,000 years, 200 years, certainly for the past 60 or 70 years, the international price of wheat and corn and soya and beef. However, when you put constant prices, it's as though we've had a bit of a shock recently, but the prices are coming back down again. And since we talked 4 months ago, they've come down a lot further. So you had a dead level. When that's a bit like, unless they are they real prices or constant prices?
I think maybe the...
that means they've been falling then.
Well, these are market prices that pertain to sugar bought within the US or within the EU. They're regulated. The world market price for sugar has done more or less what you said.
It's also subject, because because of where it's produced, they can then dump it effectively, which is what happens with the other big commodities. So, cheap. But then, can I just bring it back onto the general issue of cheap food, which is the other thing that is fascinating. You know, sugar's got to be cheap, which is part of the whole problem with the food supply chain, because we don't have prices at the end that anywhere reflect the real costs of production.
But there are one thing you haven't said before you comment on that is you've lumped sugar as sugar. There are 4 sugars. I mean, the real politics of sugar is around the battle between the sugars, between maize, between cane, between beet and artificials. That's the battle. And that's constantly driving the price down.
No, I don't really sorry, was the...
Cheap food issue.
Yeah. A bit like my response to this question about resistance, the concept of cheapness, although maybe I've used it a bit glibly here, I also think is maybe best used relationally, because cheap compared to what and in what form? For example, like, you know, here the sugar's cheap, but the food, because the cost, the final price is inflated by so many other things, that might not be cheap for people on a particular incomes. So I think maybe I need to be more careful myself when I use the argument that sugar is cheap, or maybe just be specific that I believe the commodity has been maintained at a fairly stable price, but that's not necessarily reflected in the price of final foods.
Ben, you need to read, and everyone needs to read, Victoria Schoen's paper on the Food Research Collaboration website about the cheapness of food. It's a lovely analysis of this exactly question, so forgive me interrupting.
No,
it's all
you.
beautifully put out there. How cheap is cheap, absolute cheapness, relative cheapness, different income differentials. You know, it was a request that came to the FRC, Food Research Collaboration, from civil society. Can you sort this out? So we've written this lovely paper.
Well, there you go. Thank you. I will read it. Hi. Sorry.
I'm Sarah. I'm a master's student at Harper Adams. Actually, Tim briefly mentioned it just now, what I'm about to ask, so it was a great segue into my question. I was wondering if you could comment on, well, like he mentioned, other sugars, because you're talking a lot about, you know, the cost of, when you're looking at the cost of sugar, it's raw sugar, you're referring to cane sugar, whereas if you look at a lot of foods in my home country of Canada, whether you're looking at chocolate bars, cake that you can buy in shops, Coca-Cola, any Coca-Cola product, there's actually not any, or very little now, and it's set in 10 years, or sorry, it was 5 years, the statistics from the government of Canada, that there's not going to be any cane sugar in it. It's all going to be different forms of sugar from corn, such as high fructose corn syrup. And actually that's facilitated by the fact that our government heavily subsidizes the corn industry, and so it's a lot cheaper to use I guess I'll call it fake sugar, than as opposed to this sugar. So I was wondering how much of what you've been saying applies to that, and also what the policy implications would be. For example, in Canada, if you remove those subsidies and maybe put them even towards healthier foods, that would actually be far more effective than any kind of sugar tax in Canada. So I was wondering if you could just comment on the use of those other sugars in the UK, as well as whether they're rising and subsidies and policy implications.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a good question, yeah. In the EU, the use of maize or corn as a feedstock for high fructose corn syrup has been politically suppressed because of the sugar lobby. In the US and Canada, evidently not so. So that explains the difference, and in some respects it's tremendously important. If you're a sugar farmer in the US, of course, it's a threat to your livelihood if businesses, like happened in the 80s, Coke and Pepsi, switch overnight to using high fructose corn syrup rather than sugar. You lose a huge customer. There's lots of literature from the medical discipline about whether this matters in terms of our health, and I'm not really qualified to speak on that. But what I will say is I don't think it matters actually all that much in other respects, which is I don't see fizzy drinks sweetened by corn syrup or sugar as being tremendously important if we're interested in reducing rates of tooth decay, for example. So again, I find myself keep saying this, but I guess it depends on the political question you have in mind as to whether this is an important determinant of that inequality or whatever.
Production, surely, isn't that your point?
Well, yeah, I was just saying that it matters in terms of, I guess, what kind of policy you can apply, because as well, like in certain provinces in Canada, because similar to the States, like each province can kind of have its own rules. Like you can have some that don't consider, say, high fructose corn syrup as sugar. So if you have certain regulations on sugar, it doesn't actually apply to those things, and then it doesn't apply to the food. And so there's huge policy implications for that as well in terms of like school meals, what you can sell to children, what you can advertise. It's huge and stuff. And so
yeah, I haven't really thought about it in that sense. You're right. In the US, for example, there's been huge court battles fought over the construction of barriers of entry, basically on the premise of, for example, the Sugar Association said that products couldn't be marketed as all natural if they had high fructose corn syrup, because that wasn't all natural like sugar was from, and this all went to court and blah, blah, blah. So it is important in that sense, but I still would suggest that it's not the be-all and end-all. In a way, it's another kind of fetish about food, which misses perhaps why people are reliant on cheap colas in whatever form. And the question about subsidies, to some extent, could be subject to the same perspective, which is that, yeah, I mean, it might make a huge difference, actually, if taxpayer subsidy or government protection of farmers was shifted to fruits and vegetables instead of, of these particular commodities. But if you're interested in labour rights, for example, it's entirely possible to have exploitative, subsidised food production systems, or or not. The issue here is, how do you organise labour? That's my opinion. So again, if you're interested in those kinds of questions, I don't think subsidies have necessarily all that much to tell you unless you can attach conditions to them, like you're going to be subject to regular audits or something like that, working conditions.
Thanks. I mean, this is actually taking us back to some very important politics.
No, it was just a point of clarification about the sugar tax. And most tax laws that have been proposed, especially in the States, have been written explicitly to include all forms of added sugar, which would include then, corn syrup, glucose syrup, all of the various varieties that you can come from. So it's something that needs to be paid attention to at the drafting of the legislation level, but it can be done, so it's inclusive of all forms of added sugar. Yeah.
I'm doing it myself. Any more questions? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Ginny. I'm now a diabetes specialist dietitian. So your slide with the product on tickled me.
Do you know this product?
It will be coming around soon enough. Yeah. My question was more about you put something around kind of how corporation are restructuring the diet. So in particular, looking at kind of snack foods and the kind of market of that. And I just look at some of your products there again and thinking about all these bigger kind of macro conversations around labour and trade and everything else. It kind of comes down to the question that lay behind comes around kind of culture. So we're snacking way more now as a culture, but also our industries in the UK are facilitating that and exporting snacking across the world. So my question is, if you try and change culture, you've got to find new jobs for people slightly around the food industry, and what are the sort of tensions there?
What Ginny was saying was, what about the jobs, basically, and the manipulation of culture is factored in. And you did actually raise an intriguing point. Were you wanting him to ask that about British food companies exporting sugary foods? What are your thoughts on both of those?
Well, yeah, apparently the UK exports over £1 billion worth of, I think, just confectionery, cakes and biscuits a year now, and it's heralded as a success story, as Tim's reminded me. I saw on the Department of Trade website. So there is an international question here, and this speaks to the politics of scale, I think, which is to suggest that a group like Action on Sugar, they've, to my mind, been focused very much on the nation state. They talk about British diets or British culture, UK diets, and it's the UK government which has a responsibility to act. Others see this more as or acknowledge and treat this more as an international problem, and call for things akin to the I think it's called the International Framework on Tobacco Control or something like that for processed foods, essentially, under the rubric of the World Health Organization. So there's a question here, as you suggest, about the appropriate level at which to manage these politically. With regards to the jobs, again, you're exactly right. Not just in manufacturing, my interest has been more in agriculture, and perhaps surprisingly here, there's more and more sugar being grown than ever before, but there's fewer and fewer people involved in making that. So even though their markets are expanding, even though their output is expanding, the labour demand is shrinking, and this has had huge problems in very poor parts of the world, with people being made redundant, essentially, and there's no easy way to find them new jobs, especially for people whose livelihoods have been embedded in this particular industry for a long time. They can't easily move, as sort of economists suggest, of factors of production elsewhere. So with something like this, if you wanted to reduce the output of sugary sweetened foods, my response would be you don't necessarily have to reduce output in its totality. It's perfectly possible, I think, for Ben and Jerry's to make other products, or to reduce the amount of sugar in their ice cream perhaps, and keep the amount of people that they employ. I don't know, actually, no. I'm saying that, but I'm unsure. The jobs would, I think the jobs could be created somewhere. Your support for the sugar tax is wanting to make that go up and that to go up to reduce production, to reduce consumption. To reduce consumption of the sugary products that those companies sell, but not necessarily to reduce the amount of money that those companies make. The question is how easily, and I'm doubting myself now, how easily can Ben and Jerry's factory and the people that it employs produce something that isn't so reliant on sugar? I don't know, actually. I don't know, as you can tell.